Alexandria.
The winter of 48 BC. Julius Caesar is trapped in the harbor district with too few men and too many enemies. To save himself, he orders the Egyptian fleet set on fire. The fire does not stay on the water. It climbs the dockside warehouses. And in those warehouses are scrolls. In the world we know, this is the beginning of the end for the greatest collection of knowledge the ancient world ever assembled. Centuries of human thought begin that night to burn. But what if they hadn't? What if the fire had been caught at the water's edge, and the Library of Alexandria had survived every century that came for it? What would the next 2,000 years of human knowledge have looked like? But the truth is harder and far more interesting. To save the Library of Alexandria, you do not have to stop a fire. You have to change whether a civilization keeps choosing, year after year, to keep its memory alive. To understand this alternate history, you have to first understand a strange and frustrating truth. The Library of Alexandria did not die in one fire. That is the legend. One night, one blaze, one catastrophe, and the wisdom of antiquity gone in an afternoon. The reality is slower, and in some ways sadder than that. The library was founded in the 3rd century BC, under the first kings of the Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great. It was not only a library, it was an institution, a research community, a place called the museum, where scholars were housed and fed and paid simply to think. The kings of Egypt hunted books the way other kings hunted land. Every ship that entered the harbor of Alexandria, the story goes, was searched, not for contraband, but for scrolls. Any book found aboard was taken to the library, copied by the library scribes, and the copy was returned to the owner. The original stayed. At its height, the collection may have held somewhere between 40,000 and 400,000 scrolls. The ancient sources disagree wildly, and we will never know the true number. But whatever it was, by an enormous margin, the largest gathering of written knowledge anywhere on Earth. And here is the part that matters for tonight. Caesar's fire in 48 BC was real. It did burn warehouses near the docks, and it almost certainly destroyed thousands of scrolls. But it did not destroy the library. The library went on. Scholars kept working there for centuries afterward. What actually killed the library was not a fire. It was time. It was a long, grinding sequence of war and neglect and shrinking budgets, and a city that slowly stopped caring. Roman civil wars damaged it. The expulsion of scholars under one suspicious emperor thinned it. The decay of the wider world around it starved it. By the time the truly final blows landed, centuries later, there may have been very little left to destroy. So the library did not fall off a cliff. It bled to death across 500 years. And that changes the question. If one fire had been the whole story, saving the library would mean catching one blaze. In the real world, the library was lost not to a single decision, but to 1,000 small failures of will. In our alternate timeline, we change one thing, and then we let it change everything downstream. We begin on the night of Caesar's fire. In our timeline, the flames reach the dockside warehouses, and the scrolls stored there burn. In this timeline, a junior officer of the Alexandrian garrison, a man whose name no chronicle records, sees the fire jump from the ships to the wharf and understands faster than anyone around him what is stacked in those buildings. He does not try to fight the whole fire. He does the one thing that works. He pulls a chain of men from the warehouse doors to the sea, and they carry out scrolls, armloads of them, baskets of them, faster than the fire can take them. It is a small act. It saves a few thousand books on a single night. By itself, it would not be enough. But here is the divergence that matters. That officer survives the war. He becomes, in this timeline, a minor but persistent figure in Alexandria, a man who, for the rest of his life, tells one story to anyone who will listen. The story is simple. The library is not safe. The library is one bad night from being gone forever. And the library must be defended like a city wall. In our timeline, no one ever made that argument loudly enough, or early enough, or to the right people. The library was always somebody's responsibility, and so it was nobody's. In this timeline, the argument lands. Within a generation, the Great Collection is no longer kept in one set of buildings by the harbor. It is copied, deliberately and at enormous expense, into duplicate archives. A second collection in the Temple District, a third in a fortified compound inland. Entire libraries seeded as gifts to friendly cities across the eastern Mediterranean. The knowledge stops being a single point that one fire or one war or one foolish ruler can erase. This is not a fantastical act. This is the entire point. The ancient world knew how to copy books. It copied books constantly. What it lacked, in our timeline, was the will to treat the survival of knowledge as an emergency. The tool existed. The habit did not. And we should be honest about the limits of this story. An alternate history is not a fairy tale. In this timeline, individual scrolls still rot. Particular books are still lost. Wars still burn particular buildings. What changes is not that nothing is ever destroyed. What changes is that no single disaster can destroy everything at once. Because the everything is no longer kept in one room. That is the divergence. Not a miracle. Not an unburnable library. Just one civilization that this time decided its own memory was worth copying twice. To understand what was saved, you have to understand what was lost. We tend to imagine the ancient world through the books it survived. But the books it survived are a tiny accidental fraction of what was once written. Take the playwrights. In our timeline, the Greek tragedian Sophocles wrote roughly 120 plays. 7 survive. 7 out of 120. The rest are gone. Not disproven, not rejected, simply not copied often enough, not stored safely enough to outlast the centuries. It is the same everywhere you look. We have the name of a scientist named Aristarchus of Samos, who argued 18 centuries before Copernicus that the Earth goes around the sun. We know he made that argument because other writers mention it. His book itself, the book where he laid out the case, is gone. We have a single damaged device pulled from a shipwreck that we call the Antikythera mechanism, a hand-cranked bronze computer of interlocking gears that modeled the motions of the heavens. It is so sophisticated that when it was first studied, some scholars refused to believe the ancient world could have built it. We have the machine. We do not have a single page explaining how it worked or who learned to make it. This is the shape of our inheritance from antiquity. It is not a library. It is a wreck. We are reading the few pages that washed ashore. So picture the alternate timeline. In the world where the library is copied and seeded and defended, the survival rate is not perfect, but it is not 7 out of 120 either. The lost plays of Sophocles are simply plays. The book of Aristarchus, arguing that the earth moves, is on a shelf, copied and recopied, read by students for 2,000 years. And it is not only the famous works. The library held the technical writing of antiquity, the engineering manuals, the medical texts, the surveying methods, the star catalogs, the geography, the catalog of the collection itself, compiled by the scholar Callimachus, which was effectively the first systematic map of human knowledge ever made. In our timeline, almost all of that working knowledge vanished. And when it vanished, later ages did not simply look it up. They had to rediscover it from nothing, or do without. In the alternate timeline, they do not have to rediscover it. It was never lost. The student of the year 800, in this imagined world, does not stand at the bottom of a long climb back up to where the ancients already stood. He starts at the top of that climb and looks up from there. Here is the seductive part of this episode. The part you have to be careful with. There is a tempting story about the surviving library, and it goes like this. The ancient Greeks were on the verge of the scientific revolution. They had geometry. They had the heliocentric idea. They had steam toys and gears and brilliant mathematics. If only the library had survived, the story says, Rome would have had the steam engine. The Renaissance would have come 1,000 years early, and we would have reached the moon in the year 700. We should slow down. That story is thrilling, and it is mostly wrong. A scientific revolution is not just a pile of books. It needs more than knowledge. It needs a society that rewards the systematic testing of ideas, that has the metallurgy to build precise instruments, that has cheap energy and cheap labor pointed in the right direction, and that has a way to spread a new result fast enough for others to build on it. The ancient world was missing several of those things, and a surviving library does not magically supply them. So no, the alternate Rome does not land on the moon, but, and this is the real and interesting point, a surviving library still changes the trajectory of science, not by 1,000 years, but meaningfully. And the mechanism is subtle. Think about how knowledge actually advances. It is not a single genius in a single flash. It is a relay. One generation hands a result to the next, and the next builds one floor higher, and hands that up in turn. The most expensive thing that can happen is for the relay to be dropped, for a floor to collapse, so that the next generation has to rebuild what was already built. In our timeline, the relay was dropped, hard. Aristarchus argued that the Earth orbits the Sun, and then that idea was effectively lost for 1,700 years, until Copernicus had to think his way back to it, almost from scratch. The result existed. The civilization simply could not hold on to it long enough for anyone to build on it. In the alternate timeline, the relay is not dropped. The heliocentric idea is not lost and refound. It is continuously available, argued over, tested against the star catalog sitting on the same shelves. The astronomer of the year 1100 in this timeline does not have to rediscover that the Earth might move. He inherits the question as a live one, with 17 centuries of accumulated argument already attached to it. And there is a quieter effect, one that historians of science find genuinely powerful. A surviving library is not just a store of answers. It is a store of methods. It preserves the habit of systematic investigation, the catalog, the cross-reference, the careful comparison of competing claims. In our timeline, Much of that scholarly machinery had to be reinvented in later centuries, painfully, by hand. In this timeline, it is simply the way educated people have always worked. So be careful with the dream. The alternate library does not hand us a 1,000-year head start. What it hands us is something more modest and more real. It hands us a science that never has to climb the same hill twice. Some of the deepest changes a surviving library would set loose are not about science at all. They are about belief. The Library of Alexandria was not only a Greek institution. It sat in one of the great crossroads of the ancient world, and it collected across cultures. It is said that the Hebrew scriptures were first translated into Greek in Alexandria, the version known as the Septuagint, precisely because the library and its scholars wanted them in the collection. Alexandria was a city where Greek philosophy, Jewish scripture, Egyptian religion, and later Christian theology all ground against each other in the same streets and the same lecture halls. It produced thinkers who tried to braid those traditions together, who read scripture with the tools of Greek logic and read Greek philosophy with the urgency of faith. In our timeline, much of that work was lost, along with everything else. The early Christian theologians of Alexandria wrote vast bodies of commentary and argument, and a great deal of it survives today only in fragments or in hostile summaries written by their opponents. Now picture the alternate timeline. The library survives, and with it survives the full record of that early collision, the complete arguments, not the fragments. Every later religious tradition that grew out of the Mediterranean world inherits, in this timeline, a far richer and far messier founding library. And that messiness matters. In our timeline, when later ages reconstructed the early centuries of a faith, they often did so from a thinned and selective record, a record in which the winning side's texts survived and the losing side's texts mostly burned. A surviving library does not erase religious conflict. It does something stranger. It keeps the losing arguments on the shelf next to the winning ones. The heresies are not forgotten. The rejected gospels, the condemned philosophies, the alternative readings, they are all still there, cataloged, available to be read again. What does a religion do when it cannot fully bury its own discarded options? In our timeline, an idea that lost a council often simply vanished, and a vanished idea is easy to forget and hard to revive. In the alternate timeline, a lost argument is only ever one trip to the library away from coming back. This could push in two directions, and an honest alternate history has to admit both. It might make the religious culture of this timeline more tolerant, more used to living alongside disagreement it cannot make disappear. Or it might make it more anxious, more prone to recurring schism, because every old quarrel is permanently within reach of anyone who wants to reopen it. Probably it does both, in different centuries and different places. But either way, the religious world of this timeline is built on a foundation our world never had. A foundation with all the rejected blueprints still folded inside it. Now we widen the lens, because the library did not only hold philosophy and scripture, it held the world. One of the greatest scholars ever to work at Alexandria was a man named Eratosthenes. Around the year 240 BC, using nothing but shadows, a measured distance between two cities, and geometry, Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth. And he got it very nearly right, within a few percent of the true figure. He knew the size of the planet. 1,800 years before Magellan's crew sailed all the way around it. The library was the center of ancient geography. Centuries later, the astronomer and geographer Ptolemy worked in Alexandria and produced a vast geographical treatise, a system for mapping the world with coordinates, with latitude and longitude, a method so durable that it shaped European mapmaking more than 1,000 years later. But here is the catch. Ptolemy made a mistake. He estimated the Earth to be significantly smaller than it really is, and he overestimated how far Asia stretched eastward. His error made the ocean between Europe and Asia look far narrower than it actually was, and that error had consequences. When Christopher Columbus argued, in our timeline, that he could reach Asia by sailing west across a short ocean, he was leaning, in part, on exactly that kind of underestimate. Columbus was wrong about the distance. He was lucky that 2 unknown continents happened to be in the way. Now think about what a surviving library does to that story. In our timeline, the careful work of Eratosthenes, the good measurement, the nearly correct circumference, was largely lost, while Ptolemy's flawed figure survived and dominated. The wrong number won because it was the number that happened to be copied. In the alternate timeline, both numbers survive. Eratosthenes sits on the shelf next to Ptolemy. The good measurement and the flawed one are read together, compared, argued over. The educated navigators of this timeline are far more likely to know the true, daunting size of the planet. And that cuts in a strange direction. A navigator who knows the ocean to the west is enormous. Genuinely, terrifyingly enormous. May be far less willing to sail blindly into it. In our timeline, the European voyages west were launched partly on a comfortable error. In this timeline, that comfortable error is corrected on the shelf. So the age of ocean exploration in this timeline might begin later, or it might begin differently. Better prepared expeditions, fitted out by people who knew exactly how far they had to go. Fewer desperate gambles, more deliberate, better provisioned, better financed voyages into an ocean whose true width was no longer a secret. Change which map survives, and you change who first crosses the great ocean, and when, and how ready they are when they get there. Now we have to confront the biggest question this episode raises. What happens to the so-called Dark Ages? First, an honest correction. Modern historians dislike the phrase Dark Ages, and for good reason. The early medieval centuries in Europe were not empty of thought, or art, or invention. A great deal happened. The phrase is a slander invented by later writers who wanted to flatter their own age. But strip away the slander and a real phenomenon remains. In the Western Mediterranean, across the centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, there was a genuine contraction of cities, of literacy, of long-distance trade, and, crucially for tonight, of the institutions that preserved and transmitted knowledge. Schools shrank. Libraries scattered. The number of people who could read the old languages fluently fell. And the chain of copying, that fragile relay we keep returning to, grew thin. Some books made it across that narrows. Many did not. Here is the part that should give us pause. An enormous share of the classical knowledge that did survive into the modern world survived only because it was preserved outside the Western Latin world entirely. Greek learning was kept alive in the surviving Eastern Roman Empire, in Constantinople. And, just as importantly, a vast body of Greek science, medicine, and philosophy was translated into Arabic, studied, corrected, and extended by scholars across the medieval Islamic world, in Baghdad, in Cairo, in the cities of Spain. When that knowledge later flowed back into Latin Europe, often through translators in Spain and Sicily, it helped to ignite the great European revival of the 12th century and beyond. In other words, our timeline got the inheritance of antiquity by the skin of its teeth, carried across the Narrows by a handful of institutions in a handful of cities, and very nearly dropped. So picture the alternate timeline. The Library of Alexandria has survived, copied, and seeded across many cities. The inheritance is no longer carried by a few fragile threads. It is carried by a thick rope. This does not mean the Western Roman Empire does not fall. It probably still falls. Empires fall for reasons of money and armies and politics. And a library cannot stop a barbarian army. But the fall in this timeline is a political event far more than an intellectual one. The roads decay and the cities shrink, but the books do not vanish with them. The contraction is gentler. The relay is not dropped. The educated world of the year 700 in this timeline is poorer and more dangerous than the world of the year 200, but it can still read everything the year 200 could read. And when stability and wealth slowly return, as they always eventually do, the revival does not have to be a recovery. It can simply be a continuation. Around the middle of the 15th century, in our timeline, Europe gained the printing press. It was one of the great hinges of all human history. The press did something no scribe could do. It made copies, fast and cheap and identical, in numbers that climbed from dozens to thousands to millions. It meant that a new idea could leave one mind and reach a whole continent within a few years. It is one of the great accelerants of science, of the Reformation, of the modern mind itself. But think carefully about what a printing press actually does. A press is a multiplier. It does not create knowledge. It copies whatever you feed into it. And in our timeline, what 15th century Europe could feed into the press was a thinned inheritance, the recovered fraction, the few plays of Sophocles, the handful of ancient texts that had survived the long narrows of the early medieval centuries and the slow attrition of 1,000 years. The press multiplied that inheritance brilliantly, but it could only multiply what had been kept. Now hold that against the alternate timeline. In the world where the library survived, the printing press arrives. It was, in the end, a mechanical idea, and clever people were always going to have it. But when it arrives, the shelf it is fed from is not the thin shelf of our timeline. It is the full shelf. Imagine the press of the year 1450 with the complete works of the ancient world still intact behind it. Every lost play, every lost treatise of mathematics and medicine, the complete geography, the complete star catalogs, the complete record of the philosophical and religious arguments of 2,000 years. In our timeline, the printing revolution poured a thin stream of antiquity across Europe. In this timeline, it pours a flood. And the effect compounds. More surviving knowledge fed into a faster copying machine means more minds reached, which means more new work produced, which means still more to copy and spread. The two great forces, a preserved inheritance and a mechanical multiplier, do not just add together. They multiply. But we should stay honest, the way we have tried to stay honest all night. A flood of books is not automatically a blessing. More texts means more contradiction, more disputed authority, more old quarrels suddenly mass-produced and placed in every literate hand. The Reformation in our timeline was, in part, a printing press event. and it was followed by more than a century of religious war. So the alternate timeline's printing revolution is not gentler. It may well be more turbulent, a louder, faster, more crowded collision of ideas. But it is also, without question, a revolution working with the whole inheritance of the ancient world in its hands, instead of the surviving fragments of it. Let us follow the alternate timeline all the way down. Past antiquity, past the medieval centuries, into the deep modern consequences. Start with the most uncomfortable one. More knowledge is not the same thing as a better world. It is tempting to assume that a timeline with a surviving library is simply a kinder, wiser, more peaceful timeline. But knowledge is a tool, and tools do not choose what they are used for. A timeline that preserves the full inheritance of antiquity preserves all of it. It preserves the medicine and the mathematics, but it also preserves the ancient world's theories of conquest, its detailed engineering of siege warfare, its philosophies that justified slavery, its catalogues of poisons. An earlier, faster accumulation of knowledge may simply mean an earlier, faster accumulation of the power to do harm. If the science of this timeline runs centuries ahead, then so, potentially, does the weaponry. A civilization that reaches the chemistry of explosives, or the industrial organization of mass production, a few centuries early, is not obviously a safer civilization. It may simply be a civilization that arrives at its most dangerous capabilities before it has learned the hard political lessons of how to survive them. Now turn to something quieter and stranger. In our timeline, the loss of the ancient world created a peculiar and powerful idea, the idea of the lost golden age. For centuries, European scholars believed that the ancients had known things that had been tragically forgotten, and that the task of the present was to recover a wisdom that had slipped through humanity's fingers. That idea, the dream of recovering lost knowledge, was one of the engines of the Renaissance. It sent scholars hunting through monastery libraries for forgotten manuscripts. It gave the act of learning a kind of romance and a kind of urgency. The past was a treasure that had been lost and might, with effort, be found. In the alternate timeline, that dream does not exist. Nothing was lost. There is no golden age to recover because the golden age never went away. The relationship of this timeline to its own past is completely different. The ancients are not revered mysterious ghosts whose wisdom must be reconstructed. They are simply the earliest authors on a continuous, unbroken shelf. And that might make this timeline less haunted by its past, more confident, more forward-looking. Or it might make it strangely complacent. A civilization that has never lost anything may never learn the most important lesson our own timeline learned from the empty shelves of Alexandria: that knowledge is fragile, that it must be actively defended, and that a civilization can, in fact, forget. There is a hard irony in that. Our timeline lost the library, and the grief of that loss taught us to value preservation, to build the archive, the backup, the redundant copy. The alternate timeline kept the library, and may, for exactly that reason, never quite believe that anything truly precious can ever burn. Some changes ripple farther than books and maps. They reach into how a whole civilization understands itself in time. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria left a permanent wound in the Western imagination. It became the original symbol of the catastrophe of forgetting, the proof that human knowledge is not safe, not guaranteed, not promised to anyone. Every modern instinct toward preservation carries an echo of that wound. The great national libraries, the careful archive, the backup, the copy, the redundant store of data kept in a second place in case the first is lost. All of it is, in some part, a long answer to a single ancient grief. You can hear that grief echo through the centuries. It is in the way we speak of the burning of Alexandria as a thing we still mourn, a loss we never met and have never stopped feeling. In the alternate timeline, that grief is missing from the foundations of the culture. An alternate civilization that never lost its great library may carry all the way into the modern age a deep and untested confidence, a quiet, unspoken assumption that knowledge, once gained, is simply permanent, that the shelf will hold, that what one generation learns, the next will always inherit, that nothing truly important can ever, finally, be lost. And there is one more thread, the hardest one to weigh. The lost works of antiquity are not only an absence in our history, they are a presence in our imagination. Every scholar who ever wondered what was in the lost books of Aristotle, every reader who ever ached for the missing plays, the missing histories, the missing science, that longing has been itself a creative force. The empty space where the knowledge should be has pulled at us for 2,000 years. In the alternate timeline, there is no empty space. The books are all there. Every question we have ached to answer is simply answered on a shelf, in a hand any student can read. And yet, this is the uncomfortable heart of the whole episode. It is not obvious that the timeline which keeps every book is the better one. It is richer in knowledge. It is almost certainly further along. But it may be a civilization that never learned to treasure what it has, because it never had to watch what it loved turn to ash on a harbor wind. Both of those worlds are real possibilities. Both of them are honest readings of how knowledge moves through time. And both of them turn, in the end, on whether one unremembered officer pulled one chain of men from a burning warehouse to the sea on a winter night in the year 48 before Christ.